So we left off in the last video right here. So we'll pick up with the importance of homemaking. And in the new arrangement, the wife was able to stay home with the children, and because of that, she was able to produce desirable goods that just could not be bought in a market, like improved health, better eating habits, and even better behavior among the children. So the homemaker's managerial skills help to maximize the well-being of the people in the home. And as the home and the children became the typical wife's main concerns, her control and influence there became increasingly strong, with the wife generally deciding even how the family's money was spent. And so major domestic decisions, from where the children would go to school, what type of religious instruction they would receive, even to the selection of new furniture or new apartment, belonged to the wife. Child rearing. So mothers increasingly grew in love and concern toward their tiny infants. One of the evidences of this is that mothers increasingly breastfed their children rather than paying wet nurses to do so, which we talked about in chapter 20 was commonplace, even though breastfeeding did involve a temporary loss of freedom. And so this surge in maternal feeling actually gave rise to a new kind of book, the child rearing books. And so they wrote about infant hygiene, and some of them even encouraged the fathers to become involved in the infant's life on a more intimate level. And parents were no less concerned for their older children as well. They tried to wrap them in strong emotional ties and provide them with a protective, intimate family. European women did begin to limit the number of children they had so that they could provide adequate care for the ones that they did have. So rather than having like 8 to 12 children, they had 2 to 3 children. And by having fewer children, parents could give those that they had better advantages, a better life, pretty much. They could give them music lessons, summer vacations, they could pay for university educations, and even provide a sizable dowry for their daughters. There were some instances where parents probably became too concerned about their children, like subjecting them to like an emotional pressure cooker almost, because many children with parents like that, especially as they turned to adolescence, felt the need for greater independence. And so they would do anything to break away because they felt like they were under so much emotional pressure. And part of that stemmed from the biological and medical theories of the day that led parents to believe that they passed on their own emotional characteristics to their children, making them directly responsible for any abnormality that a child had. The famous psychologist Sigmund Freud emerged around this time, and he was the founder of psychoanalysis. And he observed that hysteria in his patients appeared to originate in repressed feelings about bitter early childhood experiences. And one of Freud's most influential ideas concerned the tensions that resulted from the son's instinctive competition with the father for the mother's love and affection. And so he concluded that much of the unconscious psychological energy that comes out in children or in adults is pent-up sexual energy. So his ideas, if nothing else, reflected the tremendous emotional intensity of family life in the late 19th century. The triumph of science and industry. So the rate at which scientific advancements were coming forth was ever increasing, and the fact that people were figuring out practical uses for science meant that science exercised growing influence on human thought. And so I'm just going to throw a bunch of scientific advancements at you really quickly. But these scientific discoveries from the 1830s onward increasingly translated into material improvements for everyday people, for the general population. It wasn't restricted just to science or just to scientists. So, building on Newton's laws, physicists came up with the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. And of course, thermodynamics was used in mechanical engineering, in chemical processes, and in many other fields. Also, the law of conservation of energy said that different forms of energy like heat and electricity and magnetism could be converted, but they could not be created or destroyed. Another advancement, chemists came up with ways to measure the atomic weight of different elements. And in 1869, Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev codified the rules of chemistry with the periodic table. And I'll put his name up here as associated with the periodic table. Okay, so Mendeleev. Organic chemistry. Researchers in German chemical companies discovered ways of turning coal tar into synthetic dyes for the fashion world. People were glad to be wearing different color garments. Electricity was transformed into a commercial form of energy used on a large scale. And so this burst of industrial creativity and technological innovation was called the Second Industrial Revolution, and it promoted strong economic growth. It was a leading force driving urban improvement, and it even led to the rising standard of living for many citizens. And even though not all ordinary citizens had detailed scientific knowledge, everyday experience and articles in newspapers impressed the importance of science on the everyday popular mind. So scientific research also progressed rapidly outside of the world of industry and technology, and sometimes directly challenged traditional beliefs. So that brings us to Darwin and natural selection. So Charles Darwin carefully collected specimens of different animal species during a scientific voyage that he took. And basically he concluded from his data that all life had gradually evolved from a common ancestral origin in an unending struggle for survival. And so in his work on the origin of species by the means of natural selection, Darwin argued that chance differences among members of a given species that prove useful in the struggle for survival are selected naturally and gradually spread to the entire species through reproduction. And so Darwin's theory greatly influenced European thought, and he was pretty much hailed as the quote-unquote Newton of biology, the great scientist who had once again revealed the powers of objective science. From the 1830s onward, many thinkers even tried to apply scientific methods to the study of society. And these new social scientists studied massive sets of numerical data, data about children, crime, population, and countless other issues. And they developed new statistical methods to analyze these facts scientifically and supposedly to test their theories. And so there was one English philosopher, a guy named Herbert Spencer, who took Darwin's theory a step further, claiming that the human race was driven forward to ever greater specialization and progress by a brutal economic force that determined survival of the fittest. And not surprisingly, the weak in this scenario are the poor people, and the strong in this scenario are the wealthy. And so this made Herbert Spencer and other social Darwinists, as they came to be called, especially popular with the upper middle class. So that brings us to realism in literature. And we have a few names for this one, so I'm going to make this smaller so we can write those down. So in literature, the key themes of realism emerged in the 1840s. And this was just a strict, scientifically objective approach to depicting life. And so their subjects were taboo for the time period. They wrote about strikes, violence, alcoholism, sex, and all under the microscope to reveal human beings as simply components of the physical world whose behavior was just determined by heredity and environment. The realist movement began in France mainly because Romanticism had never really been completely dominant there. And so 3 of realism's greatest authors came from France. And the first one is Honor de Balzac. And he spent 30 years writing about post-revolutionary French life. And his work is known as the human comedy. And so he portrays urban society as completely immoral and grasping and brutal. The second realist author was Gustave Flaubert. Probably butchering that. And his masterpiece was Madame Bovary. And in this work, he portrayed the middle class as petty and smug and hypocritical. And this work is really unparalleled in its depth and accuracy of psychological insight. The third French realist author is Émile Zola. And he wrote carefully researched, gripping stories that featured the stock exchange, life in the big department store, and the army, as well as life in the slums and bloody coal strikes. Like many of the realists, Zola sympathized with socialism, and that was evident in his novel Germinal, written in 1885. Another renowned realist author was Count Leo Tolstoy from Russia. And out of these, he's probably the most popular. But in his greatest work, War and Peace, he developed his fatalistic theory of history, which pretty much regards free will as a complete illusion. And yet he still offered a central message that human love and trust and everyday family ties are life's most important and enduring values. So realism came late to the United States, but it flourished in the 20th century through authors like Theodore Dreiser, who wrote, his first novel was Sister Carrie, written in 1900, that so outraged conventional morality that the publisher withdrew the book. Okay, so that's going to bring our Chapter 24 video lectures to a close.